Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome aboard, and if you are returning, welcome back. Now let's get into the episode. With more and more treaties being signed with Indian people, Western land is beginning to be surveyed and mapped this year. Also, a currency is chosen, and this country's first public university is born. Peace treaties, boundary disputes, and new diplomacy all collide to shape this republic that we're still building. This is 1785 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and the Falmouth Gazette publishes its first issue, becoming Maine's first newspaper. The founders of this paper have created it for the express purpose of advocating for Maine's separation from Massachusetts, an idea that we'll of course revisit, though decades from now. We're going to do something we rarely do and head overseas for our next story as a new technology has been sweeping Europe by storm. The aerostat. Just under 2 years ago, Joseph Montgolfier and his brother publicly demonstrated a balloon made of paper and cotton filled with hot air lifting a small basket of wool, and captivated their audience in Annonay, France. Flight, which has long been the dream of so many inventors, is made possible. They soon set to work crafting larger and more buoyant balloons and set their sights on human flight. In order to ensure a human can survive a flight thousands of feet above the ground, the brothers fill the basket of one of their newest balloons with a duck, a chicken, and a sheep, launching the tethered balloon which returns after 3 minutes. All the animals survive uninjured, and the inventor's confidence that altitude will not kill its passengers is affirmed. Just 5 months after the very first public demonstration, a man named de Rosier takes a 20-minute flight in a balloon over France, reaching a maximum height estimated at 3,000 feet, and balloonomania is born. Jean-Pierre Blanchard was inspired by the Montgolfier brothers and took his first flight in a balloon in March of last year. While Blanchard was in England, he bumped into an American named John Jeffries, and he tells him about his goal of crossing the English Channel via balloon. Jeffries orders to fund the project in exchange for nothing other than a spot in the basket, and on January 7th of this year the pair takes off. They complete the flight in a hydrogen gas balloon and remain in the air for 2.5 hours before safely landing, becoming internationally famous for the daring flight and spawning a wave of inventors across the world, all developing and refining their own versions of hot air and hydrogen balloons. Within weeks, Ireland sees its first manned flight, and in summer of this year, Blanchard flies over the Netherlands. For now, it remains impractical for long-distance travel or carrying groups and supplies, but these early forays into aviation are another step in shrinking the world, a process that speeds up exponentially, as we are soon to see in America. On January 11th, the Confederation Congress reconvenes in New York City after having moved around multiple times last year, most recently meeting in Trenton, New Jersey. Relations with Indians remains a priority as the American population is eager to expand westward, and on the 21st, they approve the contentious Treaty of Fort Stanwix. On the same day this treaty is approved, another treaty is being signed in Fort McIntosh with Richard Butler, Arthur Lee, and George Rogers Clark serving as the United States delegation. The goal is to establish the first boundary in the Northwest and to gain clear title to Delaware lands in Pennsylvania for the Commonwealth. Millions of acres are ceded, and an Indian reservation in the Ohio country is defined, though again, tribal leaders will later claim the delegates present are operating without authority to sign on behalf of the tribes they represent. More details to come later in the episode. 6 days later, on January 27th, The University of Georgia is chartered by the state's General Assembly, meeting in Savannah. The charter, penned by Abraham Baldwin, envisions a publicly supported institution for higher learning. While classes won't begin for years, this is the first time a state-chartered public university is founded in the United States. In Massachusetts on the 29th, John Hancock resigns as governor, allegedly due to his failing health. Following his resignation, a gubernatorial election is set to be held in April. Throughout March, a figure we'll continue to hear more about, Brigadier General Josiah Harmar, is removing illegal settlers from the Northwest Territory, operating under orders from Congress as no official land surveys have been conducted. Many of the settlers whose words are recorded acknowledge their error in creating homesteads west of the states without approval, but they petition Harmar and his men for approval to remain in their homes. His position is firm despite pleas from the settlers, though a 1-month reprieve is eventually granted, allowing the settlers to make necessary arrangements in order to complete the move. Back to Massachusetts, where the gubernatorial election is held on April 4th, and James Bowdoin, the former president of the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention, runs on a platform of fiscal responsibility. He receives more votes than any of his rivals, but not a majority of the votes cast. An 18-10 vote in the Senate secures Bowdoin the election, and he begins serving as the president of the Executive Council. Lacking a strong central government, various state governments quarrel among themselves as they try to look out for their own economies. The combination of a large inherited war debt and major distrust of currency pose significant problems for the states. In 1782, the Continental Congress stopped the payments of interest on all federal loan certificates, leaving the states to assume the responsibility for paying the interest on their certificates held by their own residents. Some states have established tariffs on outside states and implemented proprietary currency. In Pennsylvania, the government attempts to use the power of money creation to solve for this problem, creating certificates of interest given to public creditors that can be used as tax payments. There are already some 160,000 pounds of these certificates already in circulation, and now, in March, Pennsylvania authorizes the emission of an additional 100,000 pounds. Another interstate issue is that of disputed waterways, such as those used by both Maryland and Virginia. George Washington has an interest in the fate of these waterways as he holds western lands and believes infrastructure around these waterways will facilitate domestic trade. He offers to host a conference at Mount Vernon to deal with issues regarding the use of the Pocomoke and Potomac rivers as well as the Chesapeake Bay. On March 28th, the group draws up a 13-point agreement governing navigational rights on rivers and in the bay, extending to issues such as toll duties, commerce regulations, fishing rights, and debt collection. They also compose a letter to the President of the Executive Council of Pennsylvania describing the plans to open up navigation into the Ohio River, and request that Pennsylvania legislature exempts Virginia and Maryland vessels from all but the most economically necessary duties. With this Mount Vernon Conference, the precedent is set that state representatives meet to discuss areas of mutual concern and work together to create mutually beneficial policies, even if the Confederation Congress, through its limited power, cannot create such policies. On May 20th, Congress adopts the Land Ordinance to raise money by selling land acquired from the Treaty of Paris. The public land survey system is created to map the land to be sold and divides the Northwest Territory into 640-acre rectangular land parcels called townships, each being further divided to 36 20-acre lots, with the 16th remaining free for schooling. Each acre is set at a price of $1. Because Congress lacks the power to levy and collect taxes, it hopes that selling land in this manner will help to refill the U.S. Treasury. The ordinance offers structure to the currently chaotic push westward and begins the long, complex process of turning the frontier into farmland and settlers into citizens. Thomas Hutchins is appointed the geographer of the United States, and General Harmar's role expands to support his surveying of the recently acquired land. The military provides necessary protection for surveyors as Indian tribes native to the area are increasingly hostile toward the U.S. government's efforts to impose boundaries on them and secure land for settlements. John Adams becomes the first American ambassador to Great Britain and arrives in London on May 26. Less than 1 week later, on June 1st, he meets King George III at the court of St. James in London. He is the first American diplomat to meet the king from the newly independent colony turned sovereign nation of America. It is a tense but civil beginning, and this meeting marks a key step toward normalized relations with the former enemy. Adam writes to John Jay the day after the meeting, recollecting it, so we'll pick up from him. And then addressed myself to His Majesty in the following words: Sir, the United States of America have appointed me their minister plenipotentiary to your Majesty and have directed me to deliver to your Majesty this letter, which contains the evidence of it. It is in obedience to their express commands that I have the honor to assure your Majesty of their unanimous disposition and desire to cultivate the most friendly and liberal intercourse between your Majesty's subjects and their citizens, and of their best wishes for your Majesty's health and happiness, and for that of your royal family. The appointment of a minister from the United States to your Majesty's court will form an epoch in the history of England and America. I think myself more fortunate than all my fellow citizens in having the distinguished honor to be the first to stand in your Majesty's royal presence in a diplomatic character, and I shall esteem myself the happiest of men if I can be instrumental in recommending my country more and more to your Majesty's royal benevolence and of restoring an entire esteem, confidence, and affection, or in better words, the old good nature and the old good humor between people who, though separated by an ocean and under different governments, have the same language, a similar religion, and kindred blood. I beg your Majesty's permission to add that, although I have sometimes before been entrusted by my country, it was never in my whole life in a manner so agreeable to myself. The king listened to every word I said with dignity, it is true, but with an apparent emotion. Whether it was the nature of the interview or whether it was my visible agitation, for I felt more than I did or could express, that touched him, I cannot say, but he was much affected and answered me with more tremor than I had spoken with and said, Sir, the circumstances of this audience are so extraordinary, the language you have now held is so extremely proper, and the feelings you have discovered so justly adapted to the occasion that I must say that I not only receive with pleasure the assurances of the friendly dispositions of the United States, but that I am very glad the choice has fallen upon you to be their minister. I wish you, sir, to believe, and that it may be understood in America, that I have done nothing in the late contest but what I thought myself indispensably bound to do by the duty which I owe to my people. I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, as I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. The moment I see such sentiments and language as yours prevail, and a disposition to give to this country the preference, that moment I shall let the circumstances of language, religion, and blood have their natural and full effect. I dare not say these were the king's precise words, and it is even possible that I may have in some particular mistaken his meaning for, although his pronunciation is as distinct as I ever heard. On July 6, the United States Congress officially adopts the dollar as its unit of currency and creates a decimal-based monetary system. It's a radical idea, as most countries use awkward mixes of pounds, shillings, and pence, and America is only the second country to use a decimalized currency. The adoption is thanks in part to thinkers like Thomas Jefferson and Robert Morris, who have long advocated for a simpler system. We covered the idea of this decimalized currency being introduced in '82. On July 13th, Stephen Hopkins, a signatory of the United States Declaration of Independence, dies. He was born on March 7th, 1707 in Providence, Rhode Island, and was a cousin of Benedict Arnold. Hopkins played a large role in transforming Providence from a small village with muddy streets to a thriving commercial center. He was also instrumental in establishing Rhode Island's present-day boundaries and was involved in erecting a telescope in Providence for observing the transit of Venus, which occurred in '69. At a meeting of the General Assembly of Rhode Island in '74, Hopkins introduced a bill to prevent further importation of slaves and freed those slaves which he owned. And that same year offered one of my favorite quotes regarding the impending revolution: "Powder and ball will decide this question. The gun and bayonet alone will finish the contest in which we are engaged. And any of you who cannot bring your minds to this mode of adjusting this question had better retire in time." He later voted to approve the Declaration of Independence on July 4th and signed the engrossed copy on August 2nd. He suffered from the shaking palsy, which caused his signature on the Declaration to appear unsteady, and he used his left hand to steady his right. He reportedly stated at the signing, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." Hopkins is buried in the North Burying Ground at Providence. The inscription on his gravesite reads, "Sacred to the memory of the illustrious Stephen Hopkins of Revolutionary fame, attested by his signature to the Declaration of our national independence. Great in counsel from sagacity of mind, magnanimous in sentiment, firm in purpose, and good as great from benevolence of heart. He stood in the front rank of statesmen and patriots, self-educated, yet among the most learned of men. His vast treasury of useful knowledge, his great retentive and reflective powers, combined with his social nature, made him the most interesting of companions in private life. His name is engraved on the immortal records of the Revolution, and can never die. His titles to that distinction are engraved on this monument, reared by the grateful admiration of his native state in honor of her favorite son." Late summer brings new global ties. On September 10th, the United States signs the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with Prussia. The treaty, negotiated by Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, promotes free trade and includes humane rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. The Prussian king, Frederick the Great, supports these and other terms, and the United States cements a diplomatic bond with another one of Europe's major powers. In October, to support the surveying efforts and establish a military presence, General Harmar orders the construction of a fort near the confluence of the Ohio and Muskingum rivers. The fort will serve as a base for U.S. troops and surveyors operating in the region. He soon receives orders to advance to the Great Miami River against the Shawnee, who have refused to sign treaties ceding their lands. By November, the early arrival of winter and inadequate supplies for the soldiers guarding the surveyors leads to the suspension of surveying activities for the year. General Harmar reports to Congress that his troops are barefoot and miserably off for clothing, a familiar complaint amongst military leaders in early America. I mentioned earlier we'd be getting a little bit more detailed about the current state of relations between the United States and the Indians. So before we cover another landmark treaty in that space, let's run down the current state of these dynamics. The United States faces the immense task of asserting authority over its vast western territories while managing workable relationships with the numerous native nations that occupy the land. Though the Treaty of Paris has formally ended hostilities between the United States and Great Britain, it has done nothing to settle the volatile and violent frontier disputes between settlers and Indians, particularly in the southern back country. The boundaries drawn in Europe ignore the sovereignty of Indian nations, and now, that exclusion fuels deep and persistent tensions across the frontier. Congress is keenly aware that peace on the western and southern borders is essential to national unity, land speculation, and further economic development, yet lacks the power to enforce its policies effectively. Indian relations, although nominally a federal concern, are continually undermined by the actions of individual settlers and some state governments, especially Georgia and North Carolina. Cherokee lands west of North Carolina are steadily encroached upon by the Cumberland settlements, amongst others, but despite repeated complaints from the Cherokee Nation to both state and federal authorities, little is done to halt the unlawful settlement. The Cherokee are divided internally. Younger warriors and many members of the Chickamauga faction advocate resistance, while older leaders increasingly seek negotiation to prevent full-scale war. Let me reinforce that point. The inherent threat of conflict and a refusal of any land claims is the sole reason any of these negotiations and treaties take place. In an effort to regularize relations and assert federal primacy over Indian affairs, Congress has resolved to enter into formal treaties with the major native nations to accomplish three primary objectives. First, to establish firm and recognized boundaries between native lands and U.S. settlements, securing as favorable terms as possible for the U.S. Secondly, to affirm native allegiance and peace with the United States, thereby hopefully discouraging alliances with Britain or Spain. Thirdly, and finally, to open paths for regulated trade under U.S. oversight and to bind native economies to American markets. The first treaty with these ends in mind was the treaty with the Delaware Nation in 78, signed in the heat of the Revolution. Its primary function was to allow U.S. troops to pass through Delaware territory, and the treaty also included language envisioning the creation of a Native American state within the Union, though the treaty was soon broken. Distrust spread as American soldiers and militia abused the Delaware's neutrality and stole supplies from villages, and after the Gnaddenhutton massacre, all trust broke down with the Delaware. The next to be signed was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which we covered last year, in which the U.S. demanded land cessions as punishment for Iroquois alliances with the British during the Revolution. Vast tracts of land in western New York and Pennsylvania were ceded to the United States under protest from the Iroquois Confederacy. Then, and as we covered earlier in the episode, the Treaty of Fort McIntosh seeks to define tribal boundaries in the Ohio Country and establish peace with northern tribes following the war. Large land cessions are extracted, especially in eastern Ohio, and the treaty tries to impose a U.S. legal framework for punishing crimes across these internal borders, and sets terms for future trade. That brings us to today's treaty between the United States and representatives of the Cherokee Nation, signed November 28th at a plantation owned by General Andrew Pickens in Hopewell, South Carolina. The U.S. Commissioners Benjamin Hawkins, Andrew Pickens, and Joseph Martin represent the authority of the Confederation Congress, while the Cherokee delegation includes 37 chiefs and headmen. In its various articles, the treaty establishes a defined boundary between U.S. and Cherokee lands, largely reflecting the lines drawn in colonial-era treaties, prohibits U.S. citizens from settling on Cherokee land, the penalty for doing so being a forfeiture of legal protection, states that any U.S. citizen who commits crimes against the Cherokee will be punished in the same manner as if the same had been committed against a citizen of the United States, declares that any Cherokee who commits violence against U.S. citizens will be delivered up to the United States for trial and punishment, grants the United States the exclusive right to regulate trade with the Cherokee, and finally establishes a trading post to be operated under federal oversight in Cherokee land. The Treaty of Hopewell is an important precedent, marking the first formal treaty signed between the United States and the Cherokee Nation under the Articles of Confederation, and establishing a diplomatic precedent that will be followed in subsequent treaties with other Indian nations, as we'll see early in tomorrow's episode. Despite the formal language of peace and protection, tensions remain unresolved beneath the surface and driven by a swelling settler population and economic hunger for land. The terms of this treaty are soon to be violated. On the same day of this treaty's signing in New Hampshire, another signatory of the Declaration, William Whipple, dies. He was born in 1730 and, upon leaving school, entered on board one of his father's merchant vessels, captaining his own ship at the age of 21. After a disappointing courtship ending in his being left at the altar by his fiancée, Whipple married his cousin, Catherine Moffat. In 1776, he was appointed a delegate to the Continental Congress, and Whipple wrote, on January 7th of 1776, "This year, my friend, is big with mighty events. Nothing less than the fate of America depends on the virtue of her sons. And if they do not have virtue enough to support the most glorious cause ever human beings were engaged in, they don't deserve the blessings of freedom." During the remaining years of Whipple's life, he supported the abolition of slavery, freeing his own slaves and saying, "A recommendation is gone hither for raising some regiments of blacks. This, I suppose, will lay a foundation for the emancipation of those wretches in that country. I hope it will be the means of dispensing the blessings of freedom to all humanity in America." Now, the New Hampshire Gazette notes his passing, saying, "On Monday the 28th of November died, universally lamented, the Honorable General William Whipple, Judge of the Superior Court of New Hampshire. In him concentrated every principle that exalts the dignity of man. His disinterested patriotism and public services are now known to all, and when newspaper encomiums are lost in oblivion, the pen of the historian shall preserve the remembrance of his virtue in the breast of succeeding generations. During the long course of unequaled sufferings, he endured his lot with a firmness correspondent to the greatness of his mind. He viewed his approaching dissolution with a heroic fortitude, in full confidence that he who made him knew best how to dispose of him. In his extremest agonies, his mind was still revolving schemes for the happiness of mankind, and those sentiments of benevolence which distinguished him while living were the last that died in him. He was generous and humane, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might rise up and say, 'This was a man.'" As the year draws to a close, the North Carolina General Assembly incorporates Lincolnton, named after General Benjamin Lincoln, a hero of the Revolution. The town becomes the county seat of Lincoln County and reflects a pattern playing out across the states. New towns are rising, new counties forming, new roads forging connections where once there was only forest. With the Revolution over, the building of America has just begun. Throughout this year, some major problems go unresolved. Spain still controls New Orleans and denies American access to the lower Mississippi River, infuriating settlers in the Southwest. British troops continue to occupy forts in the Northwest, ignoring treaty obligations. Interstate tariffs hinder trade, and paper currency's value fluctuates wildly. Congress' inability to enforce the laws it passes or raise revenue becomes more obvious with each passing month. But despite these troubles, 1785 is a year of motion. It's a year America literally begins to map itself. A year of diplomacy with a former enemy, of innovative reforms, and of new institutions. It, like so many others to come, is a year of firsts. the first ambassador to Britain, the first treaty with Prussia, the first Western land system, the first decimal currency, and the first state-chartered public university. These steps are modest, but are stepping stones for the republic in the works that is still uncertain of its place in the world. Thanks for listening to our story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Next time, we'll head into 1786, where economic unrest boils over into full-blown rebellion and the seeds of federal reform are finally sown. And as always, thanks for listening.